my grandfather was a big proponent of this, right? Although Ayurveda and allopathy doesn't talk that much, he was someone who all his best friends were actually allopathic doctors, right? And I remember a very senior doctor at Breach Candy Hospital saying, after your grandfather's passed, I actually don't have that many people in the Ayurveda industry I could talk to, and he was the only person I could talk to. And my dada always said that was a travesty, right? The sciences should talk, and the reason they should talk is because they are not actually competitors, right? And I'll give you an example to explain this. I was talking to an Ayurvedic doctor from the south who gave me this beautiful example, right? He said, think about this. There is a village, right? And in the village, there is a stream that flows through the village, right? Right through the village. And so the villagers have to cross this stream, right? So in the summer, the stream is not filled with water, so they just walk past the stream. But in the monsoons, after the rain, the stream gets filled with water. Now there are two ways for the villagers to get across this stream. One is to make a raft service so that you transport the villagers from one side of the stream to the other. The other is you train the villagers on how to swim so they can actually swim through the stream themselves, right? And that's really the difference between Ayurveda and allopathy, if you think about it, right? Allopathy is more symptomatic. It looks at sort of addressing a disease or an ailment from its symptoms. Ayurveda is more holistic, and it looks at going to the root cause of the problem and removing it, right?
Hey Arjun, thanks a lot for taking out the time to speak to us. Really looking forward to this conversation. Also, many congrats on the recent exit you had with Dr. Vedyas.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Aviral. Very excited to be here, and yeah, excited for the conversation.
Awesome. Would love to go back and start at the very beginning. And why this is important is you've it's not a first generation entrepreneur business, right? You've been, it's in your family. Would love to understand that, the origins of this, and then how you grew up, where you went to school, and where the idea of actually starting this came about. If you could talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So I think I'm fortunate that my life story has a lot of my business's story as well. So yeah, I think that's a great starting point. Vedya, my last name means Ayurvedic doctor. I come from a legacy of 150 years of Ayurveda in my family. So my grandfather, great grandfather, and sort of generations before all Ayurvedic doctors. As a family, we have a sort of IP of 100 plus proprietary formulations passed down from generation to generation, and that's what sort of I inherited. But my great grandfather moved from Gujarat to Bombay at the time, and started a small Ayurvedic clinic. As was customary at the time, my dada graduated from med school and joined his father, and then eventually took on the clinic. The legacy of our business was actually no business. So my dada was a very successful Ayurvedic doctor. In the 80s and 90s, he saw 300 patients a day in his clinic, had 12,000 patients writing to him via post, which is the e-commerce of that time. And he was a man of service, so he didn't charge for any consultation. He had a free consultation. And he didn't really care for sales, distribution, marketing, or strategy. Right? He was a doctor who ran a clinic, and that was his purpose, and that's what he did. My dad graduated from college and he wanted to make it a brand, but doctors and businessmen don't see eye to eye. And so eventually my dad went ahead and started a completely different brand in the jewelry and watch space. But I grew up with Ayurveda, right? So it was my family legacy, but it was also an important part of my life. So I suffered from juvenile bronchitis at age 2. I grew up with pumps, nebulizers, steroids, inhalers, all of that kind of stuff. I was not allowed to play cricket. For me, I was pulled off the cricket field at age 7, and that was a big sort of moment for me. I love cricket, and so I was really disappointed that because of the dust on the cricket field, I couldn't play cricket. And 14 years of painstaking treatment later, I was cured of asthma by my dada. So other than family legacy, Ayurveda had a pretty important sort of uh, it was a very important part of my life, right? And the big turning point for me was at age 16, I then became cricket captain of my school. Not that cricket was a big deal in my school, not that I was the best player on the team, but I was the most regular guy. But for me, that was a defining moment in my life, right? And Ayurveda gave me that. I went to Brown University when I was 17 and a half, and while I learned a lot there, I think what I saw there was a move toward natural and organic products. I saw yoga being repackaged, right? Yoga mats, yoga gyms, yoga apparel, and this multi-billion-dollar industry in the US, which was taking what we had with yoga and repackaging and rebranding to make it sexy, right? And we've talked about this before. So I thought to myself, like, why can't we do the same with Ayurveda? I came back to India in 2013, and I started a job on the investing side. I worked at a private equity fund called L Capital, private equity arm of the Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy Group, and primarily investing in the consumer space. Got the good fortune of spending a lot of time with consumer brands. Spent time with 150 entrepreneurs across apparel, lifestyle, retail, FMCG, food and beverage, um, cars, bikes, cinema, across the board in these spaces, and saw a big change in the Indian consumer as well, right? So 2014 government change, Ministry of Ayush was created, Patanjali revolution happened. So there's a lot happening with Ayurveda. But also, we grew up in an India which was obsessed with imported products, right? Like, I was gifted a Japanese electronic sharpener for my 11th birthday from a store that only sold imported products. And that was changing in India. Indian consumers were happy to consume quintessentially Indian brands, and Ayurveda was undergoing this sort of renaissance that had never happened. And unfortunately, my dada passed in this time period as well. And so we had this legacy, we had these formulations. I had this entrepreneurial bug in me, and I'm super patriotic. I wear this sort of flag of India on my hand all the time. And so I thought, there's no better time to take a punt. And at 24 and a half, I mean, what's the worst that can happen, right? At that age, you're able to take risks. So I took the risk and I took on the family legacy. And I think sort of started the brand, named it after my grandfather. So my dada's name was Dr. Vedya. So I called the brand Dr. Vedya. And yeah, while it was sort of taking forward a family legacy, which was really old, the brand building part was completely from scratch. We had no brand at all.
Understand. Understand. And what was the process of actually starting this entirely new journey, where you obviously you have a good brand because of your Dadaji, but you are building it from scratch, and you may have seen some brand building at Louis Vuitton because it's a private equity focused on consumer. What were the early steps that you took? Any guidance, advice you'd like to share for entrepreneurs who are starting in a D2C space today?
Yeah, so I think, look, when I started, my grandfather largely sold chronic ailment focused products, because most of the patients that came to him were diabetes, arthritis, and asthma. And I was thinking to myself at that time, 24 and a half, 24 years old, I'm not going to be selling diabetes and arthritis and asthma. That's not sexy. That's not cool, right? And so I just took a blanket call that I'm only going to sell products that I find cool. And then I went back into the stable of products, and my dad had a chat with me, and he said, we have a liver protector called Live IU, but my father used to tell me to have it before I drink because it helped with a hangover. And so went back into my grandfather's writings, and it did actually have long-term liver protection, but short-term it protected from the hangover. And so I thought, wow, that's a really cool product to start at this age. And so we started sort of repackaged the liver protector, called it Live It Up, and that was a hangover shield. And then we had a product called HerboFit, which takes the goodness of Chyawanprash and puts it in a capsule. So solves for this black bitter sticky paste, which is the Ayurvedic multivitamin, and multivitaminize it into a capsule form, right? So convenient. And so I said, okay, that's the only two products I'm gonna launch. It's fundamentally new age. It's what appeals to me, and it'll be fun because I'll enjoy marketing these products. And I think that was, I would say, the biggest learning and the biggest mistake that I could make. Right, I went into FMCG with two products that appealed to me, uh, and I think the biggest advice that I can give to entrepreneurs, both embarking on a D2C journey and embarking on building a consumer brand, is do not build the brand for your friends and family. Consumer brands are not to be built for you, and don't take feedback that your friends and family give you to heart, because that's a hobby, right? If you're building a product which caters to your thousand friends and family, unless it's my father's business selling luxury jewelry at a very high price point, you can't build a FMCG brand catering to 1,000 consumers. And so I learned very quickly that the market was there, but it was a very, very small market, and if I really wanted this to be a scalable business, I had to go deeper. And so eventually I went back and sort of in November 2017 launched another 27 products that made the reach of our brand wider. And eventually, when we exited the business, we actually had more than 70 products, right? To allow ourselves the ability to reach more consumers, as opposed to sort of staying into this narrow mindset. And that's why the advice is like, I mean, while I may be saying in sort of crude terms, don't build a business for your friends and family. The larger point here is look at your total addressable market, because that's extremely important when you're looking to build a business.
Right now, that's a very interesting viewpoint. A lot of founders early on are told to be very focused and just pick a niche and build one thing, right? And that's an interesting point that you made, that when you are building a consumer brand, especially in India, you should have depth in product SKUs and don't build for yourself as well. I think those two are very interesting insights. Was there the thought after this initial experiment that didn't work and then you realize that the market is elsewhere, that would it be an urban focused company for people like us, or would it also be for people living in rural areas or smaller cities? Did you think about that? And that will bring us to a topic which Mazen will talk about.
Yeah, so I think Aviral, interesting point there, right? So I think, look, the reason that I'm a proponent for trying many things is that, if you really go into market with just one product or one SKU and it doesn't work for you, doesn't give you the chance to do more, right? And so I think with launching multiple products, we learned a lot as young entrepreneurs as well, right? And I think from the perspective of, is it an urban phenomenon, or will it be a brand for Bharat? I think what was really clear for me was I was not building a luxury brand, right? Other than my sexual wellness and my muscle gain range, all of my products were below the price point of 200 rupees, right, per unit. And so I knew that this had to be a mass premium brand, and it had to be a brand that didn't alienate consumers. Also, Ayurveda is something that's fundamentally Indian, and so proudly Indian was at the front and center of our packaging, and it was something that was really important to the brand. And so I never saw this as something which would be a phenomenon that only stays in urban India. And so we did a lot of experiments to go deeper, and I think eventually genuinely were able to build a brand for Bharat. And sort of the biggest insight there was that 82% of our customers actually came from outside the top 10 cities.
Thanks, Arjun. Really an interesting story of how you got started. Would like to dive into our topic for this week, which is building a consumer brand for Bharat. Uh, so, first of all, is selling Ayurveda hard or easy? I mean, was it something that just came naturally to you, or did you have to, kind of think about it differently?
No, so I think it's not easy, but look, selling anything is not easy, right? Even if it comes naturally to you, it may come naturally to you, but it has to also come naturally to the customers, right? And so I think, while Ayurveda is my family legacy, I have a personal belief in it more than just family legacy, because it had a very deep impact in my life. I think understanding sort of what the customer wanted, and being close to the customer was really important for us, right? And so we didn't stop to say that, hey, because I like ads that come in English, or I like a creative that looks like this, that's how we should position the brand. I think we focused a lot on customer insights and data, and I remember one incident very, very uh, clearly, like vividly, right? Uh, I heard a really jarring song, and then I just like popped over to someone from my performance marketing team, and I saw an ad that looked really, really bad, according to me, right? So I was like, hey, we can try a bunch of things, but this ad totally doesn't work for me, and I'm going to put my foot down here. And he came back to me and he said, hey, this ad is running at 7.2x ROI. So do you really want me to stop this ad? And that to me was a really important insight, is you really have to be close to your customer. And from that day, we my wife, who built the business with me, every Sunday we spent 2 hours doing customer service ourselves. We did this, we were used to doing this because in the early days, customer service, we used to take the phone home on weekends and do the customer service ourselves. But but doing customer service, staying close to your customer and getting those insights, was so important that, Mazen, honestly, our top selling SKU was a product called Herbo Build. It was an all Ayurvedic muscle gain supplement that was, and for a very long time continued to be, number one bestseller in the health and personal care category, on Amazon. And this product came to us because we were listening to the customer. We launched it in July 2019 when customers came to us and said, launch this.
That's amazing. And can you maybe give our listeners a bit more of an insight into what your customer base looks like?
Yeah, so Dr. Vedya's, the one very interesting thing about us was that from the time we started, we actually focused on our own website and our own platform, right? D2C is a sexy term today. It's something that everybody's talking about. But in 2016, 2017, when we were trying to build D2C, people were questioning whether customers would come to a website, would buy Ayurveda online, would they ever repeat on a website, would a website ever be able to scale to more than 200 orders a day? Like all of these were like questions that were coming to us at that time. Now it's we're in a different world, right? But I think the reason we stayed focused on our own website, and it still sort of gave the business more than two-thirds of our sales, was because it allowed us to stay close to the customer and understand the customer and keep interacting with this customer, right? And so Dr. Vaidya's had more than 1.5 million customers buy from the website over the 4.5 years that I ran the business. And the customers were 82% of them were outside the top 10 cities, and we were able to fulfill more than 16,500 pin codes, right? So for me, if you ask me, Dr. Vedyas was a funded, Series A funded company. We took it to exit. We got a lot of awards. We got a lot of recognition. We took the team from 4 to 150 people. But the real value that we were able to add is a free consultation and access to high quality Ayurvedic products at the touch of consumers' fingertips in an Anantnag and a Trichy and an Imphal and a Muzaffarnagar. And to me, that's the real value we added, right? We gave these customers access to high quality products and care at the touch of their fingertips using the power of digital.
No, that's amazing, and I think, as you said, D2C is now a buzzword. It's something everyone's talking about, but what makes it so difficult? I mean, like, can you talk to us about what D2C really is and how it's different from?
Yeah, so I'll tell you first why it's so powerful, and then I'll tell you what's become what was difficult in our time, and then what's difficult today, right? So why is D2C so powerful in a country like India specifically, right? I think that's a really important question. So India is a huge market, right? We have a sort of 1.3 billion plus customers in this ecosystem. It's a young population. It's a robust middle class. That's disposable income is increasing at a very rapid pace. So all of these things seem like markers for an amazing story to build a consumer brand. But the reality is that India is many countries within a country. Distribution is extremely difficult and extremely expensive because organized retail penetration is less than 20% in our country, right? So if you go to a market like the US and you crack an account like Walmart, you're getting a sizable business. You crack an account like Whole Foods, or you crack an account like Target, you're getting sizable business. In India, even if you crack the biggest retailer in India, your penetration of that retailer is still 2 3 4%, right? And so even though they have a large number of stores, it's not like it is in the developed markets, right? And so building an FMCG brand or building an offline retail brand that is sizable and pan India, or that can go very deep into India, takes a lot of time, effort, and energy. And that's why you see sort of large players dominating the ecosystem who have multi-million, 100 million plus dollars in revenue, and control the ecosystem because they've been able to solve this problem over a long period of time, right? If you're building an FMCG brand from scratch, you see a lot of local brands and a lot of regional brands that aren't able to scale outside local and regional. And so this is largely a big challenge with distribution in India, right? Think about it. If you're building one city like Mumbai, you need 20, 25, 30 reps on field. Now, if you're building 10 cities, you may need 150 reps. If you're building 100 cities, you may need 1,000 reps, right? 1,000 salespeople. And so this is what D2C really gives you, right? It gave you the ability to reach all of these customers across a really large subcontinent of India directly, right? And be able to interact with them, be able to communicate new products to them, be able to talk to them more than just the way you do in offline retail, which is you give it to a super stockist who gives it to a distributor who gives it to a retailer, and so the brand is not able to touch the consumer. And so that's the real power of D2C, and what's so exciting about the opportunity that was there and still exists. Why was it difficult when we were building? I said it earlier as well, but I'll touch upon it again. Actually, at that time, when online and e-commerce was being built in India, I remember my first day in private equity. I got the opportunity to look at an online apparel retailer, and all of us know this company. It's scaled, it's been acquired, all of that. But I got the opportunity to do that, and we were sitting in our office thinking, will people in India buy apparel online? Right? Will they be able to try clothes at their home? And as time went, fine, we established the use cases of the horizontals. We then established the use case of large verticals in the furniture space, in the apparel space, in the innerwear space. We were able to establish these verticals, right, in the lenses and and sort of spectacle space. But then people started questioning, will people go to a brand's website and buy online? Is this even going to happen? Because e-commerce penetration is still so low in India. So I think when we were building D2C, that was a challenge. Like, how do we actually make people come to our website and buy? And what do we need to do to sort of handhold them through this process, right? And COD was rampant and still is rampant, but was like 85-90% of sales. Now it's come down to, let's say, 60-65% of sales, and customers are willing to buy and pay online. But all of those problems were sort of existent at that time. Today, D2C is a buzzword, right? And like any buzzword in India, whether it was food tech or ed tech or hyperlocal, once it becomes a buzzword, you get 100 players entering the ecosystem, right? And so today, the challenge with D2C is that it's now not as open or wide a space as it was when we were building. And so you really have to do much more and get many more things right and make lesser mistakes than what we could make in sort of 16, 17, 18 when we were building.
No, I think that's an amazing insight. And, as a founder, you kind of have to go through that process and learn from your mistakes. But would like to talk a bit about how you build trust. I mean, you're not just selling in big cities, right? You're reaching a lot of people in rural India, your brand. And you touched on this, how, you're competing with people who have large brands and millions of dollars to spend. How did you start off and build trust with consumers?
Yeah, I think so. It's a very good question. And any consumer brand, any D2C brand, any FMCG brand, any of us who are sort of challenger brands disrupting an ecosystem, disrupting a market, uh, you do face that challenge, right? Like, why should someone buy from you when they've been buying from someone for the last 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, or their family has been buying from someone for the last 80, 100 years, right? So you have to establish your use case, right? And so I think we went on three pegs. The first peg was 150 years of legacy. I think that was really fortunate for us to have, right? 150 years of legacy is something that most brands don't get, and we had that, and we leveraged off that. The second thing was the name of the company, right? While Vedya is my last name, Vedya also means Ayurvedic doctor. And so most people have heard of their own Ved, right? And so we're very clever about choosing the name of the company also when we chose Dr. Vedyas, because it was an instant connect. Even though you may not have connected to our brand, you connected to a Ved, and so subconsciously, subliminally, you're saying, I know this brand. I've heard of this brand, right? So when our customer service people picked up the phone, they used to say, Dr. Vedyas, 150 years of legacy. Naam to suna hoga. You would have heard the name of this brand, right? Because you would have heard of Vedya, and so that allowed us to build trust. And the third most important thing is, look, you're building products that consumers ingest in our space, but even if they put it on their body or put it on their face or whatever they do, I think a really strict focus on quality and a no sort of uh, uh, no compromise approach on that, right? So every customer complaint, every customer feedback was taken extremely seriously, and that allowed us to build trust and credibility in the ecosystem. Look, when you're 1,000 orders a day, then you have enough customers to say, okay, now I'm a brand. I have like 500 reviews on Amazon. I have 500,000 customers who bought from my website. So then you're fine. I think the real sort of struggle of building the brand and trust and credibility was built on these three pegs.
Just amazing. Building trust through familiarity, even though people didn't know about your company, you created that connection with them. But would like to spend a minute just talking a bit about Ayurveda. And I believe you said Ayurveda and allopathy shouldn't be viewed as competitors, but rather complementary sciences. So can you maybe expand a bit on that?
Yeah. So my grandfather was a big proponent of this, right? Although Ayurveda and allopathy doesn't talk that much, he was someone who all his best friends were actually allopathic doctors, right? And I remember a very senior doctor at Breach Candy Hospital saying, after your grandfather's passed, I actually don't have that many people in the Ayurveda industry I could talk to, and he was the only person I could talk to. And my dada always said that was a travesty, right? The sciences should talk, and the reason they should talk is because they are not actually competitors, right? And I'll give you an example to explain this. I was talking to an Ayurvedic doctor from the south who gave me this beautiful example, right? He said, think about this. There is a village, right? And in the village, there is a stream that flows through the village, right? Right through the village. And so the villagers have to cross this stream, right? So in the summer, the stream is not filled with water, so they just walk past the stream. But in the monsoons, after the rain, the stream gets filled with water. Now there are two ways for the villagers to get across this stream. One is to make a raft service so that you transport the villagers from one side of the stream to the other. The other is you train the villagers on how to swim so they can actually swim through the stream themselves, right? And that's really the difference between Ayurveda and allopathy. If you think about it, right? Allopathy is more symptomatic. It looks at sort of addressing a disease or an ailment from its symptoms. Ayurveda is more holistic, and it looks at going to the root cause of the problem and removing it, right? So when I was growing up, I said earlier in the conversation as well that I grew up with pumps, steroids, nebulizers, inhalers. Now, when I had an asthma attack, I could not have an Ayurvedic medicine and think about looking at managing that attack over 2 to 3 weeks, because I mean that I would not be able to get past that attack, right? And so I had to take symptomatic instant relief. And similarly with a fever, when you get a fever, you will take a paracetamol to bring down the fever. But in the long term, if you want to remove the asthma from your system, or you want to build your immunity to not have that fever again, that's when you look at Ayurveda, right? And so I think that given that symptomatic versus holistic and long term, there is actually a place for both the sciences to coexist and work together.
It's a unique perspective, and that's a great analogy to help people kind of understand how they look at treatment differently. Would like to also touch a bit on the exit. Can you tell us how that happened? Was it part of the plan, or did it just right place, right time?
Yeah, so I think Mazin, that's a question which I've got a lot over the last month or so, right? Since the exit has become sort of public now, and a lot of people said, "Teach me how to exit, or how should I exit my business?" And I think that it was never the plan, right? You never think about building a business for an exit. If you get one, and we've had the good fortune of having one. You're very thankful for it, right? And so we've been extremely thankful for it. But I think when we were raising capital, we were looking for people who believed in our long-term vision, and so we chose partners that believed in our long-term vision and had the highest conviction to what we were doing. And they happened to be strategics, and they happened to have a long-term interest and wanted to purchase the entire business, and we were fortunate to get that outcome. But I think it was never the plan from day one. I never thought that starting this business, taking forward my family legacy, that I would eventually sell it and get this exit and all of that. It just happened, and it's a good validation to what we were able to build. But I think it was never the plan as such.
You mentioned it was bittersweet for you. Can you talk about that a little bit? I know a lot of people are like, "Wow, amazing! I'll get an exit and I'll make money." But I think it's your baby as well, and especially for you because of the family association. What was that feeling like? And talk us through the other side of an exit, not just the amazing fact that you've been able to take your company to that situation.
Yeah, so I think Avril, I wrote about this yesterday as well. Look, this meant a lot to both my wife and I, right? Dr. Vedya's. It was a place where we spent 12 to 14 hours every single day. Our office was more our home than our home. Uh, I wore a Dr. Vedya's t-shirt every single day, right? And today I'm not wearing one, and it feels a little bit odd that I'm doing this conversation without my company's logo on it. My laptop cover had my brand on it. The mug had my brand on it. My phone cover had my brand on it. I proposed to my wife with a packet of our hangover products saying, "Will you marry me?" Before I gave her the ring, right? So it was a really really important part of our life, and one day just saying that I'm not going to go back to that office. I mean, we didn't sleep the night before. We told our team. I'm not someone to get really emotional, but I actually cried when I told our team that we're going to be exiting this business, and it's going to be great because you guys have a great journey ahead, but we're not going to be a part of it. And the last day we actually went to the office, we had from the elevator till the time till our desks, we actually had 70 to 80 members of our team holding roses with messages for us saying how we've impacted their lives, right? And leaving that is not easy, but I think thinking of the larger picture, I think we're very fortunate to be able to now stop and reflect and remember those good memories. But saying goodbye to something that was the most important part of your life for a very long time, and for me, 4.5 years, for my wife, 3.5 years, was never easy. It was our identity, right? And so to say goodbye to that identity, it's tough. It's really tough. But I think that. The endings are really powerful, right? And so I think that reflecting, stopping, and thinking forward is something that's an experience that very few people get at the age that we've got it, and so we're living with that now.
Amazing. What next for you now?
No idea. No clue at all. So I think Aviral, for me now, for Jisha and I both, this ecosystem has given us a lot, right? The consumer brands ecosystem has given us a lot. Um, it taught us a lot as well, but we learned a lot, right? So through the time we were handing over the business as Jan and Feb, we actually wrote out a playbook for building a D2C brand in India, which encapsulated my 4.5 years and her 3.5 years of experience. And we broke it up into modules, and we said, can we now give this to founders, right? And so our goal over the next 6 to 9 months, at least for 2021, we're not going to build
Hmm.
for some time now because we need some time to rejig and think of something new. And it takes time to think of an idea. But until then, actually, we want to empower the next 100 D2C and enablers to D2C, right? Those entrepreneurs. And so we're doing a bunch of things to be able to do this. We're investing, actively angel investing now into brands that we believe in. But also mentoring founders and giving them our time because I think that that's the most important thing you can do. And whether it's getting them the right agencies or advising them on the right product strategy or brand strategy, we're giving our time freely to founders. There are some funds that have asked us to spend some time and help them think through their investment strategy and their portfolio strategy. So we're doing that. But most fun is actually we're teaching our playbook as a course in a few places.
Wow, nice.
Uh, we're, we're helping prospective D2C founders and also people who have offline businesses wanting to move online. Just given the pandemic, I think a lot of offline businesses have been hurt very badly. So we're teaching it as a course. So I think that's what's keeping us busy for now. So yeah, for the next for 2021, we want to be able to use our experiences and enable and empower another 100 founders. And if we do that, then we've given something back to the ecosystem that really rewarded us.
Is your course going to be public? What's the plan there? Are you
Yeah, very soon.
awesome?
We're going to start teaching it in
Really
April.
looking
So
forward
you'll
to
see it
that.
very soon. Yeah.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you for sharing your story, Arjun, with us. We have one final question which we ask all our guests, and that's why we call this Founders Unfiltered. What's one piece of unfiltered feedback or advice you've got in your journey? Generally, this is very honest or brutal, I would say, that really change your perspective in how you are building or in your career. If you could share with us.
Yeah, so it's tough to pinpoint one, but I'll give you three that I got, right? So the first one I got was from my dad. And this is when I was trying to juggle figuring out whether Dr. Vedya's had scope and also keeping my private equity job, which was really comfortable. And he said, Arjun, as an entrepreneur, you can't be slightly pregnant, right? That was a really, really sort of funny yet powerful advice, which is entrepreneurship, if you want it to be successful, cannot be your side hustle. It doesn't mean that you can't have a side hustle, but if you're really building a scalable company and you want to build something of real value, then it can't be a side hustle. And that's okay if it has to be a side hustle, but then it can't lead to a sort of startup that's super scalable, right? So I think that was one piece of advice. The second piece of advice I got from my ex boss Uday, and he said, "You have 24 hours in a day, of which you have to sleep 8. You have to unwind for 2 or 3, and so that leaves you 14, 15 hours basically where you can work. And you can't do everything on your own because you have only 14, 15 hours. So you'll end up leaving the office many times saying, I have these 6 things left and I have to do it, but I'll do it at 2 in the morning and 3 in the morning. And that's not the right way to do it, right? So you definitely can't do it alone.
Mm.
And we were very late to build a really good team. But I think that building a solid team of the right people with the right culture and the sort of right incentives is really important. And the third piece of advice, well, not advice, but just something I learned along the way was you got to be thick skinned. If you believe in your vision, uh, you got to be able to take criticism and advice and praise all with a pinch of salt, right? You can't let success get to your head. You can't let criticism bog you down. I remember a day when someone said, this is really a stupid idea. Why are you wasting your time doing this when you have such a nice family business that your father has been running for a very long time? I came back home on a Friday and wasn't like our business had taken off and was on sort of a jetpack at that time, right? This was 2017 and we were still struggling. I came back on a Friday evening and I just didn't leave my room till Sunday, till Monday morning. I was just in my room and I said that really, am I wasting my
Right.
time? Am I doing something wrong? But I realized that the same people who say that to you when you're a success say, I was the one who told you should do
Right.
this, right? So I think that you have to have a support system, but you also have to have thick skin to take both feedback and praise with a pinch of salt.
Amazing. Amazing piece of advice. I love the slightly pregnant one. That's awesome. It's a big takeaway for me as well. Thanks a lot, Arjun, for your time. Really appreciated the conversation. Wish you a lot of success in what you're planning next.
Thanks, Aviral. Thanks, Masin. It's been a pleasure.